I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement, please. We'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving our relationships between nations and improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Let us each in our own way acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and consider how we can best move forward in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So welcome everyone to this week's webinar. We are so happy to have Luana Rubin with us tonight. We appreciate her support. She is an incredible supporter of CQA by doing these webinars, also purchasing Trend Text Challenge entries to support the CQA and so much more. We totally appreciate her support. I have to read most of this because I get worn out just saying all the things that Luana does. She's the proud owner of Equilter.com. And if you haven't purchased fabric from her, you should. I'm working on a quilt right now with some of her fabrics. They are absolutely amazing. She is also a Bernina ambassador. She's a frequent guest on Quilting Arts TV and PBS. She's an artist and activist, a color trend forecaster, a textile designer, a wildlife photographer, a curator and juror, organizing the Love Your Mother and the Love for the Gaia exhibits. Her art quilts have been displayed at the United Nations in Geneva, NASA in Houston, the Carter Center, Clinton Presidential Library, Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., as well as many other museums and galleries, and Houston International Quilt Festival, and many more. So please welcome Luana to this week's webinar. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's so great to be with all my Canadian friends. I see a lot of friends who I recognize on the Q&A list there, and a lot of new friends. So happy to meet you, and I hope you enjoy this. This presentation is, gosh, it's really hard to choose what to share with you whenever I give these presentations. I'll just show you as much as I can. You'll probably be overwhelmed and you'll want to go back and watch the recording. And also I'll give you a link to my Flickr page where you can go and look at all the photos too. But of course, what you're getting here is the commentary. So I do want to encourage you to watch this on the largest screen possible. If you can't do that right now, I really encourage you to go back and watch the recording on a large screen, as big as possible, so you can appreciate all of the details of the photos that I have very carefully edited, so you can see all the beautiful details of the quilts. And definitely take notes, because you're going to have lots of ideas, and hopefully you're going to get a creative tsunami out of all the juice from this experience. I'm going to go through several different shows over the last year, and I'm going to start out with the Atlanta Quilt Festival, which we were also a sponsor of. And it was organized by predominantly a group of African-American women. And these are some of the quilts that I really love. I didn't take these photos, I just pulled them off of Facebook. But the part of the story I wanted to share with you is that in the middle of the busiest day, the power went out. And what did those ladies do? They got out their phones and they turned out the flashlight and they kept looking at the quilts and admiring them in the dark with their flashlights. That's dedication, but that's typical of how quilters roll, right? There were tributes to John Lewis, and this was, I believe this was, yeah, his mother, Willie Mae Carter Lewis. And that's just a really brief little introduction. I'm going to jump very quickly to the Poulamar de Fil in Nantes, France in April of last year. Now this show is coming up again this year, pretty quick, next month. And if you've never been to that show, it's kind of a boutique show. It's very different from something like your show in Canada or Houston. Instead of having a big exhibit, there's actually a selection of artists who are invited to show their work in galleries. And every year there's a theme, and last year the theme was the Netherlands and Dutch arts and crafts. So when you entered the show, and by the way, the Nantes is at the mouth of the Loire Valley. So if you want to take a cruise and go see the Sleeping Beauty Castle and all the other beautiful castles, that's where the cruise ships take off, which I did last year. This was the image when you enter the show last year. And this was the Dutch version of a Birmingham album quilt. So there is a little detail on the left from a Vermeer painting, and you may recall that last year there was a spectacular Vermeer exhibit at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And in the quilt on the right-hand side, you'll see the girl with the pearl earring, a windmill, the row houses in Amsterdam, the ships, so I thought that was a really clever way of taking an existing traditional quilt form and making it into this Dutch themed quilt. And of course, when we think of Dutch theme, we also think of Delft blue or blue and white. And so there was an exhibit of traditional quilts that were made all with blue and white, more traditional types of fabrics and embroidery. You can see that the flowers there were embroidered, similar to how redwork embroidery is done, but in this case it was blue and white, and it was such a lovely and refreshing exhibit. There was also a challenge, and I was one of the judges for this challenge. And the challenge was to the local French quilters to make quilts that were of the theme of the Netherlands. So here are some of the quilts that were in that exhibit celebrating the the culture of the Netherlands. There's a lot of embroidery in there too, which I really appreciated. But this was the modern version of Dutch. So what's interesting to me is how the Modern Quilt Guild has expanded all over the world, and every country or every region has their own interpretation of what is modern. So this is definitely a modern quilt, but if you look closely, there are themes related to Amsterdam and the Netherlands. The one that I pick out right away is the bicycle there. If you've ever been to Amsterdam, you're kind of taking your life in your own hands because everybody rides a bike. And at the end of the day, when everybody rides home, I mean, people ride up to an hour to get from their work downtown out to the suburbs, and there are just thousands of bicycles that fill the streets. It's pretty amazing. Here was another beautiful, colorful quilt. Now, later on, I'm going to be talking about a trend of circles. And so this is the first one I'm showing you that's obviously the theme of circles, but also rainbow colors, and that's going to be a theme tonight. Now, also at the show in France, we had a Russian quilter. If you don't know who she is, Gala Grotto, very interesting quilter. I actually bought her Madonna quilt in Canada. I'm trying to think of which show it was. It was about 5 years ago. And I encouraged her to keep making quilts like that. She did, and now she's become an extremely popular quilter in Europe. And just this last year, she came to Houston. But we were a sponsor of her exhibit in France. And if you look on the bottom left there, there's just a quick little snippet of her story. So she's a Russian artist who fled to Ukraine many years ago and then to France, and now she lives in France. This is some of her work. She has a very recognizable style. Another artist here who I wanted to point out to you is Hilda Hoogwaarts, and she makes these incredible quilts out of large-scale, bright African prints that are produced either in or sold through the Netherlands. So if you've heard of Dutch wax prints and that whole industry of textiles that are sold to West Africa. We carry that line, by the way. It's called Jansen Holland. If you're interested in these kind of large, bold prints, just search for Holland on my website. This is a really famous quilt that was at Birmingham about 5 years ago. And when I saw this quilt, I said, oh my gosh, I have got to meet this woman. And since then, I've met her and hung out with her and become friends. And she has recently published a book, which we also carry. Here's another example of her quilts made with these large scale, really bold African prints. I also want to mention Quilt National. Now, there are just a few images here from the exhibit from the summer of 2023 last year. But the reason I bring it up is that the call for entry is this year. I believe it's in November later this year. And if you're interested in trying to get into one of the most prestigious and competitive contemporary quilt exhibits, you will want to go to the website for the Dairy Barn Arts Center and look for Quilt National. And I've been going to this show. It's every other year. I've been going to this for, I don't know, I think 12 years, and we've been a sponsor of it. And there are just some really stunning contemporary quilts in this show. And there is a book that they publish that goes along with the show. So I'm going to show you a few things from the Festival of Quilts in Birmingham last August. This is a piece by a Dutch quilter named Janneke de Vries Bodzinga. Hopefully I haven't slaughtered that name. She's one of the artists who I've been following for many years. You may have seen some of her work in the past. She did some really stunning images of African women, real graphic, bold, large-scale pieces. So this is a bit of a departure for her, but if you look closely, you see the face in there? Another wonderful artist, Katalin Horvath, who is a Hungarian artist who lives in the UK. And she has a soft spot in her heart, as I do, for endangered species. So that was the topic of this piece, which is heavily, heavily thread painted. This was kind of an interesting piece because it was three separate figures. You could almost say that it's three-dimensional. It's actually two-dimensional, and there are three figure cutouts that hung together on the wall. And they were quite tall. I think they must have been at least 6 feet tall. You had to crane your neck to look up at it on the wall. Here's a lovely traditional quilt where we can really appreciate the craftsmanship that went into this. Beautiful atmospheric piece. And again, we see that trend of circles, right? So just make a note of how many different ways quilters are expressing with the very simple, basic theme of circles. And in this case, it's also a very simple, basic color theme of blue and white. So if somebody told you you have to make a quilt with circles and blue and white, uh, don't be limited by that. Another traditional quilt, lovely colors, kind of secondary colors of that salmon pink and teal blue. This reminds her of a rainbow in Alaska. And of course, the green of the forest is in there too. I included that because it reminds me a lot of what I've experienced when I visit Canada. This is actually a quilt of, it's 9 different small quilts. The image of the Queen, the young Queen Elizabeth, when she was at her coronation, has been sort of silhouetted there. And then you can see that there's kind of a layering of newspaper headlines and other words that relate to Britain. So it's celebrating and memorializing her 70 years as a queen. Helen Creasy's mermaid quilt was a big favorite at the show, and I see that she has made it into a pattern, and right now we're trying to get that pattern so we can sell it through Equilter. It's quite a large piece. The mermaid is life size, or what we imagine a life size of a mermaid would be. This is similar to the work of Veruska Zarata, who you may have seen her Joan of Arc quilt. It's all paper pieced. Helen has done some really intense machine quilting, so you may not see that everything is paper pieced, but that is the case. And if you are one of these people who loves doing huge, intricate paper pieced quilts, also maybe from Legit Kits, that's another company that designs and sell these. I think Helen is somebody to watch. And I love that complementary color story that she's got going with the warm and the cool colors. Here's another piece that I thought was just very cute relating to Little Red Riding Hood, but she's the wolf. And here's a beautiful calligraphy or script piece in ancient Celtic script with lots of tiny applique and embroidery. This is one of those pieces that I'll just say I wish you could see it in person because it was just so stunning in person. You'll have to use your imagination. But if you are interested in things like illuminated manuscripts on the Book of Kells, here's an idea of how you can take that inspiration and turn it into a quilt. So Joe Cunningham had a gallery at the Festival of Quilts, and he asked if I would take a picture of him, and then he said it's the best picture that anybody ever took of him, and he used it all over his social media. So he loved that picture so much, I thought I would include him in this picture of one of his quilts that were exhibited. Now, there was a whole category of sustainability as the theme, and this was all made of recycled or used denim. And how interesting is that? All the different values from light to dark of denim. And of course, this is the 80s rock star Billy Idol. I especially love how the spiky hair was rendered just with denim. This is just a charming quilt, isn't it? We've got the fox in a paper piece design on the top and the rabbit on the bottom. And the trees are also paper pieced, and then all of the little stars. I guess they're living in alternate realities there. This is just a lovely atmospheric piece, but I really appreciated the technical expertise that was used to draft this. So you can see that the road that runs through this valley is a combination of different types of blocks. And with the flying geese that are running down the middle, it really gives a sense of movement, right? It carries your eye from the foreground into the distance. Now, this was a quilt that was actually made from a pattern by Kim McLean. And this is something that I'm talking to quilters about all around the world right now, and those who organize shows, is that it's so important to put that information. If the person who made the quilt is not the person who designed the quilt, in other words, if the quilt is made from a pattern, it is so important to put that on the artist name card. In this case, it was not put on the artist's name card. It was only listed in the booklet. And if you didn't purchase the booklet, you wouldn't know that Kim McLean designed this pattern. Megan Gibson did make it. The original is made with kind of a cream or off-white background. And in this case, Megan chose to make this quilt with kind of a cool gray background, which really makes the colors pop. Kim McLean, we also carry these patterns if you're curious about her, is an Australian pattern designer who designs quilts, and they're meant to be used with Kaffe Fassett's colorful fabrics. This was a very sweet, well, I would say bittersweet and poignant quilt. It was made by grandparents who had lost contact with their grandchildren. And so each little block, it was actually a huge quilt, but each block was made by a grandparent who was missing a grandchild. And this was, it's a modern quilt, but it's also an art quilt. And we're seeing more and more overlapping between contemporary or art quilts with modern quilts. And I just thought this was a very stylish and just an amazing use of silhouettes that were filled with color and patchwork. Friday night drinks before COVID. Do you remember that? Seems so long ago, doesn't it? Now, sadly, I'm sure almost all of you know this by now, but the Tokyo Quilt Festival that went on for 30 or 35 years, something like that, at the baseball stadium, the Tokyo Dome. The very last show was January 2020. I had gone to the show about a dozen times, and I was there at the last show. And the pandemic chased us home, which was quite sad. And then a few months after that, they announced that that would be the last show. So now the Japanese quilters are having smaller shows, and I have a couple friends there, and I follow them on Facebook. So I just wanted to show you some of these incredible, beautiful contemporary quilts. Here's some of the quilters. The lady in the gray and black kimono is my friend Yasuko Saito. In fact, I own one of her quilts. So she's one of the organizers of this particular show. And these are both pieces by her. The piece that I have is made all from recycled silk kimono pieces. Some more pieces from that little show in Japan. The one on the left is really more contemporary. The one on the right has some more traditional Japanese elements with the cranes. And I just can't get enough of these Japanese quilts. I love them. I'm anxious for things to really get started in Japan again. But so far, all of the shows that have started up post-pandemic are slow. And my friend there has said, no, don't come yet. But they're working on a bigger show. It may take another couple years for it to happen. Another Japanese quilt, and if you look closely, you can see in the ribbons some of those traditional Japanese elements or designs. Here's a more contemporary piece. I love that ombre effect, but of course it's all done with piecing of tiny little pieces. A very atmospheric piece. Isn't that lovely? We love color, but sometimes it's nice to see a piece like this that's all done in black and white and neutrals. Now, here are two very different pieces. On the left is a traditional bridge, kind of a scenic quilt, and on the right, a more modern quilt, black and white in color. And black and white in color has been a trend for several years now. So now we're just watching how it's unfolding, how it's mutating. Now, I wanted to show you a few things from Australia. As I said, when you go to shows around the world, one of the most delightful parts of going to another show is to see how those local artists express color and design from their point of view. And that's certainly true of Australian quilters. In April, I believe, is the quilt show in Melbourne. I have been to that show once, and it's held in this absolutely gorgeous Victorian building that has all of these painted embellishments on the inside of the building. If you can make it to that show in Melbourne once in life, I do really suggest that. There are a couple more Australian quilts. And you can see that the hummingbird is paper pieced. It has a kind of a faceted jewel-like quality. And these are two different Frida Kahlo quilts. The one on the right is by Sue Devaney. That's somebody who I'm very familiar with. Actually, her gorilla quilt that was in my For the Love of Gaia curated exhibit, it went on to win Best of Show in the recent Australian exhibit. So she's another artist to watch. But it's interesting, isn't it, how Frida Kahlo, who was such an amazing woman artist in Mexico, how she still continues to inspire us, and not just in Mexico or the US, but she inspires artists all over the world. A couple other interesting. Now, I didn't go to the show, so these are just images that I got off the internet. Okay, so now we're in Houston. So this, of course, takes place the last week of October. And if you've been there before, you recognize that big red carpet. One nice thing about going to Houston is you're not standing or walking around on cement for hours and hours a day. And it's one of the biggest shows in the world. So you are on your feet for hours and hours a day. I'm a member of SACWA. In fact, recently I was really delighted to find out I'd been accepted to the SACWA JAM program. JAM stands for Juried Art Members. And SACWA always has an exhibit, a gallery, I should say, in Houston. And this year the theme was red. And I might also mention that this was an exhibit that is, I believe it's traveling, and there's a call for entry out now for the next color theme, which is blue, and that's coming up later this year. So if you're looking for calls for entry and you're inspired by the blue quilts, that's something to take a look at. Here are a couple more uh, representational quilts. The one on the left is by Carol Breyer Fallert, and it is basically, she's doing some interesting work these days. She took this photo when she was in Cuba. She had it printed out. She sent it out to a service and had it printed out, and then she stitched the photo. And so that's what the one on the left is. The one on the right, if you look at long enough, you'll see a figure in the center of it, and there's a story that goes with that quilt by Susan Polanski. If you're interested, you can look her up and see what the story is about. But that is a quite a powerful quilt with lots of movement and energy. But these are both part of the red exhibit. Also, there was the Cherrywood Challenge. And this last year it was the Monarch Butterflies. And if you're familiar with the Cherrywood Challenges, those exhibits always travel. And so they are small quilts, they are juried in, and then there are prizes as well. And I just have to tell you, I could talk for 2 hours about Houston, so I'm just giving you just a little taste. I will tell you about this at the end, but you can go to my Flickr page and look at photos from all of these shows in more depth. There was also a beautiful exhibit about all different kinds of athletes by Anne Houle. And this was one of my favorites. My husband was a bicycle racer. He still is a cyclist, but after he had a couple bad accidents, he stopped racing, thank God. But anyway, there's the scrum. And if you're familiar with bicycle racing, this to me really captures the moment. She is such a talented artist capturing the athletes. Now, I mentioned that Gala Grotto also had an exhibit in Houston, so this is just one of her pieces that came to Houston this last year. And so this style that first started with that Madonna piece that I bought several years ago has just exploded. I mean, she is exploring all different ways of using that idea of stylized female faces. So it's a great example of how you can start out with an idea and just keep expanding and unfurling and stretching it out and see where it takes you. Now here in Colorado, we have the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum, and I just wanted to mention to you, every 2 years we have the men's show. I was the juror for that maybe 7 or 8 years ago. The show continues, and I did go to the opening this year because we also sponsor the museum. And what a great group of guys, man. I love going to that opening because it's just the energy is awesome. So we have our local Colorado celebrity, Ricky Timms, who, by the way, is selling his house and moving to Portugal. But he had something there and he was there that evening. But also, hey, you guys know Bill. He had a piece here. We often have male quilters who show their pieces in this exhibit. And this is actually a close-up of the quilt that Bill sent. I think he had a couple quilts this year, but he wrote about, well, you can see it says down there in the lower left, it's about the children that were discovered in unmarked graves. And a lot of us are making quilts about things that we care very deeply about. Sometimes they're things that happen in the past that we're just now finding out about. Sometimes it's things that are happening right now, or things that could be happening in the future that we're not too excited about. And, if you make those kind of quilts, then like me, you are an activist artist or an activist quilter. And this was a piece, if you subscribe to the Equilter newsletter, you may have seen me featuring this, but Carl had a couple pieces in the show and they were, he is a brand new quilter. He's one of those people who recently started quilting and sprang fully formed from the head of Zeus, apparently, and he's winning prizes, I believe. I know he had something in QuiltCon as well. I think he may have won a prize. But anyway, he's off to a fast start. He's somebody to keep your eye on, and this quilt was inspired by where he lives in Palm Springs, I believe. Anyway, I really admire not only his spontaneous curved piecing, but also his quilting, which was done by Becky McCoy. All right, so now we're at QuiltCon, and the first night at the award ceremony, they announced that they had record-breaking pre-registration. They already had over 10,000 people who had pre-registered. I don't have the final numbers of how many people attended, but it was a lot of people. I went up to the third floor and took this photo as people were registering before the award ceremony. So the show hadn't even started yet. So I get a press pass and I go in early and I take photos before the crowds come in because it would be impossible to get shots like this once the show opens. But I wanted to give you a sense of the show. So take a look at this picture and the next one, and what do you notice? So think about, for instance, your show in Canada or the Houston show. They use black pipe and drape as a backdrop. And often, so for instance, in Houston, there is a carpet. So here we have kind of a beige backdrop, pipe and drape, and we have the bare cement floors. So if you are submitting a quilt to the show, you have to think about it really differently because a quilt that could look really fabulous on a black background might disappear into a beige background depending on what your colors are. I don't recommend sending your all white or all beige, pale quilts to the show. You will notice that a lot of these quilts don't have a binding, but they have a faced finish. In other words, you don't see a binding around the edge that might provide a dark frame to offset the colors on the beige background. And you also need to wear really good shoes because of the cement floor. Ask me how I know. But it's a fantastic show. I love going to the show because there's a lot of youthful energy and a lot of color and, oh my gosh, a lot of creativity. So we're going to go through and I'll show you some of these categories and quilts. So this was the 11th QuiltCon, and over the last 11 years, what we understand as being a modern quilt has been changing. I'm sure you're aware of that if you are a modern quilter. So the first year we thought it was, well, traditional blocks that had been resized and recolored. And then we saw the best of show winner, and we said, "Hey, that's a modern quilt? Wow, I didn't know you could do that." And so as the years rolled by and we saw things like embroidery and applique, and we kept saying, "Wow, that's a modern quilt." What I have always said is the most fertile place in quilt making today is that place that overlaps between modern quilting and art quilting. Now, that's just my opinion. But a lot of these quilts, you will look at them and say, wow, that's a modern quilt. So I'm starting out with some pieced quilts, and they're certainly very creative, original piece quilts. And here we see an example of the black and white and color. You see the little strips of black and white prints in there? This is just an amazing technical achievement, I would say. It's not the most creative, unique, but on the other hand, it's mesmerizing. And it's a quilt, so you can see the whole quilt on the right and a close-up on the left. It's a quilt that really draws you in, and you can't help but admire the piecing. But also, look at the color. I mean, the color that is repeated again and again is a yellow-green. Have you ever thought to make a quilt where the predominant color is a yellow-green? Well, why not? Now, the quilting is really interesting, what's going on in modern quilting today. You know, a lot of quilters, especially new modern quilters, will send their quilt out to be quilted by someone else. And I encourage every modern quilter to learn how to machine quilt themselves because if you send it out to somebody else, it may not be the most creative or original quilting. But in this case, there's there are two layers of design. So there's the geometric pieced quilt, and then there's this really interesting, you know, it's repetitive, but it's still interesting and different. It's not just a whole bunch of horizontal rows of stitching. It's altering between this diamond pattern and a few rows of horizontal pinstripe quilting, which of course is machine quilting. So I mentioned before we've got a theme of circles. Well, this just has a little bit of circles in it, but look at how Nancy has used an ombre to make this quilt glow, right? So one of the ways that you can get a quilt to glow or have dimension is to use value and use ombre fabrics or the effect of ombre by going from dark to light or light to dark. Hey, it's a Canadian quilter. Maybe, I don't know if Kathleen is here, but I wanted to include a few of the Canadian quilters whose work I saw at QuiltCon. Here's another example of the black and white in color. And so she's got a cool color and a warm color going, but they're secondary colors. So, you know, it's just interesting, kind of the pink and purple versus the green and the teal. I bet a lot of you are familiar with Maria Schell's work, and when I see quilts like this, I wonder if perhaps they may have studied with Maria. Um, and maybe not. I don't know. I don't know Kathy, but I love this really creative, crazy, mixed up piecing, where something is pieced, cut apart, pieced again, cut apart, and on and on and on. And it, in this case, it's very symmetrical. There are pieces like this that are not symmetrical, but this one just is so eye-catching. And this one too. So based on a bear paw, I guess, Mindy has made a piece using a lot of complementary colors, so it's super eye-popping, and also she works with value, black and white, and dark and light. So as we look at these together, you know, think about what is it that makes these so eye-catching, and maybe there's a technique or a color combination that you would like to use in your work. So Daisy is from Norway, and I just thought this was a really interesting exercise in curved piecing. And there's a close-up on the right here, again, of that black and white in color. And I really love the combination of the dots and the black and the yellow. Yellow and various versions of yellow and orangey yellow is also a color trend, and we'll see more of that later. Here is a big swooping quilt with lots of movement and layers and interesting quilting that follows the swooping curves. And Michael Ross, he's really known for these kind of quilts, just like crazy all over scrap quilting. But of course, they're all solids, and it has been machine quilted, just horizontal pinstripe machine quilting. But there's so much movement in this piece. And of course, your quilts do not have to be square or rectangle. Here's another trend, and this has been going on for several years, but it's still something that's a lot of fun and worth watching, where something has an optical distortion. So in this case, Cecilia, and this is an artist who lives in Argentina. I've met her at the now defunct Mexico City Quilt Festival. She has taken what would have been a very traditional quilt, turned it on point, and given it a fisheye effect. So in other words, what's in the center appears to be coming closer to you, and what's on the edges appears to be moving away from you. And here's another quilt using that idea of stretching out blocks. So there's a pretty traditional quilt design somewhere in there, but you can see that she's stretched it out. And she's also used complementary colors and also values of light and darks with the blues in particular. So that's part of what makes this an eye-catching quilt that has a kind of a glowing quality. This was the winner of the viewer's choice. And I thought it was interesting that Irina came from St. Petersburg and she was actually there. I don't know if she's living in Russia now. Maybe she's out considering everything that's going on there. But again, take a look. Black and white in color, blue and white, and using value going from dark to light. So all these trends that we're talking about, this is yet another way to use it. Well, this one is pretty funny. So if you use TikTok and if you've ever looked at the little logo and it makes you feel kind of cross-eyed, it's like, the three layers of color that are out of focus. That's what Deborah has used in this. And some of you may be old enough to know what Debbie Does Quilts Triple X is referring to. But this is not an X-rated quilt. It's just kind of a laugh. Now, I talked to you about circles, and so I want to show you several different interpretations of that trend. Here's one by Carol, and Carol is from Ontario, so another Canadian quilter, and you can see she has used really mostly pastel pieced fabrics that are contrasting with black, making those circles really pop, and they're overlapping circles. Well, here's another version of circles, overlapping circles. And what's interesting here is instead of using perhaps a black and white and color, she has used brown kind of as the neutral element in this quilt. And there is kind of a rainbow effect going on from the pink to the salmon to the yellow to the lime to the Kelly green to the aqua and the blue. Another circle theme quilt. So you can see those layered circles on the right, but I also put a close-up on the left-hand side. This quilt was a combination of machine quilting and hand quilting. Now this quilt looks really great with the black background that I'm using in this PowerPoint. It was a little hard to spot from a distance. From a distance, because of the beige background, you didn't really see the quilt. What you saw was the monolith shape in the middle. And that's okay. If that's the effect that you're trying to get, then she nailed it. Another circle quilt. Oh, and I want to mention something here. So if you are sending quilts through the mail to a show that's at a distance, I really suggest that if you're, well, especially if you're a member of SAQA, that you look up the video by Bill Riker about how to pack your quilts. This quilt, unfortunately, was creased and it did not hang nicely. And I felt bad about that when I looked at it because I really love the colors and the design of the quilt. I will just say really briefly, when I ship my quilts, I roll them either on like a pool noodle, those styrofoam long tubular things, and I cut it down to match the shortest width of the quilt, and then I roll it with the top facing out, and I wrap it in acid-free tissue and then in a plastic bag to protect it in case it gets wet in shipping, and then in a long, tall box, so kind of a tubular box. There's lots of information online about this, but boy, if you have a quilt that has a lot of solid areas like this where creases are going to show up, you definitely want to roll it up and ship it in that way so the creases are not hanging there for everybody to see at the show. Here's another circular piece. Now look at the circles within circles. You can see that there are pieced circles, right, on the solid orange background, but look at the quilting. Look at the concentric circular quilting that starts kind of in the bottom right quadrant. So that's another way to layer a theme, not only in the design of the quilt top, but in the quilting as well. Here's another quilt that is using the theme of circles, but also the theme of rainbows, rainbows of color, chromatic color. And we'll see more of that in a minute. And well, you may not think that this is a circular quilt, but it does have a theme of circles, right? And I see that Lori is from Saskatchewan. So maybe this is a pattern of melting and freezing ice on a lake. Lori Paquin, her work reminds me of Irene Roderick's work too. I wonder if maybe she's been a student of Irene. But she does that really exquisite piecing. All of these lines are pieced, they're not appliqued. And if you're interested in this technique, Irene Roderick does have a book where she explains how to do this. And that, of course, that's something else that we carry. I don't tell you about anything unless it's something that I know where you can get it, and usually it's from us. And, you know, just wanting to be of service to you guys when you look at it and say, how the heck did she do that? This was a quilt that won one of the prizes, and it's a simple quilt. It's called Big Hug. I'm sure many of you know who Sheila Frampton Cooper is. She's been traveling and teaching for many years now. This was her entry, and you can see it is that black and white and color theme, and she's working with kind of sherbet ice cream shades. Now the whole quilt is on the right. There's a close-up on the left that shows the hand stitching. This quilt also won a prize. Now we're not talking about circular inspired quilts anymore. Now this is a piece that I thought really stood out. It's very eye-catching, but it was so interesting to find out that the quilter was from Australia because to me this is a very typical Australian quilt in terms of color. Did you know that houseplants are a trend? And I'm not just talking about succulents. There are actually a lot of artwork, graphic design, and prints that are coming out that depict like houses with lots of houseplants. Now that I've told you about it, you'll start to see it everywhere. Now, this had a waffle quilting, and I don't have the artist statement in front of me, but I wonder if maybe somebody else still did the quilting for Cassandra. I did notice it's a trend. I have kind of mixed feelings about this trend. It's kind of like the next step of just horizontal pin quilting all across the entire quilt without any deviation from that. In this case, it was that pin quilting both vertical and horizontal, so it created kind of a waffle check effect. Here is a pixelated flower. I thought that was lovely, and I really like the colors in this one too. And this was definitely a conversation piece. So, oh, I see that we're getting up to an hour here, Carol and Linda, so I'm going to start paging through a little bit faster. I'm going to remind you that all of these photos will be on my Flickr page, and of course, you can view the recording. Another trend was people making quilts from drawings made by other people when they were children. This woman lost her husband recently, and she made this quilt from a drawing that he made when he was a boy. I thought that was really a poignant story. And this quilt was made by a grandmother from a drawing that her grandson made. I really love this quilt. It's a map of Manhattan, and I actually used to live down there in the East Village, on the map on the left. And I'm sure you know maps have been a trend for quite a while, but now we can see that black and white and color trend being expressed in this map. This was a group quilt made by Irene Roderick and a group of other artists, and you can see the whole quilt on the right and close up on the left. This is using a Moda ombre fabric that had metallic dots in it. And I'm just going to page through a few quilts here that have similar colors. So these are expressing a similar color trend of orange, some of them with pink. This one also is orange and pink with some big stitching, hand stitching. Here's orange with a very pale kind of mint aqua green background. This was inspired by Mary Blair, who was the designer for It's a Small World at Disneyland. I know you can hear that song in your head now, right? Sorry about that. And similar, so you can see this color trends, kind of a pink and orange, and sometimes with accents of blue. Emily was the Best of Show winner a few years ago, so she continues to explore this theme of spontaneous curved quilting. Here we also see that orange and pink, but this time with that yellow green. So now, by now, I think you're starting to recognize these color combinations. Pink and orange with kind of a mossy gold and mossy green. Now, I want to show you a series of quilts quickly that are all rainbow or chromatic colored. So by now, you're going to start recognizing these trends, right? Circles, black and white in color. And now I'm introducing a new trend for you to think about: rainbows. Circles and rainbows. Rainbow colors. And by the way, there is a QuiltCon magazine. We do still have it in stock. This quilt was one of my very favorite quilts that was in the magazine. So GTFO, get the F out. This is an activist quilt having to do with reproductive rights for women. But again, we see the rainbow trend. Another one with the rainbow trend. Those are rockets. Here's one of Maria Schell's works. And you probably know Maria Schell. She lives in Anchorage, Alaska. Also wanted to show you a few black and white quilts. Here's a close-up on the left. You can see it's not just black and white solid, but there's some black and white print that has been mixed in there to add a little sparkle. This amazing quilt on the right has an image of a man's face, and you can see on the left the close-up of how that was. Well, I can invite you to look at it and try to figure out how he did it, but I think we're all scratching our head going, "Holy cow, how did he how did he make that?" Scott Cully from Berlin. This is a beautiful starburst black and white quilt that had lots of multicolor hand stitching in concentric circles. Another one of my favorites. This was from this was from a photograph of a bunch of bras and maybe panties all piled up together, and she turned it into a black and white quilt. It's pretty funny. It's called Unmentionables. So I am just going to page through the last few quilts here, and you'll see color. You'll see these trends now that I've mentioned, like yellow and orange. There's the yellow trend. This is a statement about our sorry state of politics in America. But what I liked about this is in the middle is purple, and the Capitol building is really beautifully pieced. And in the middle, we have shades of purple and pink, which represents where we all come together in the middle. This was a prize-winning group quilt for the youth category, and referring to your land acknowledgement that you gave at the beginning, Linda, you will see that the tribes and the lands that they occupied were put in this quilt that was made by a class in Portland, Oregon. This is a quilt about the fire in Lahaina, another prize winner. And Barb's quilt, equal rights for others does not mean fewer rights for you. It's not pie. So we're into the activist quilts here as we finish up at QuiltCon. Patra Jones, maternal mortality for Black women is 3 times higher for than white women in America. And if you look at the close-up on the right, she has written structural racism in the headband. I'm just going to page through some of the community quilts. The guilds around the country and around the world make quilts that are meant to be sold or raffled off to raise money for their communities. Every year they choose a color palette, and then all of the modern quilt guilds in different communities make up their version of the quilts using those colors. Sadly, as I get to the end of QuiltCon here, we have the best of show. There were 4 quilts that just off the top of my head that were about gun violence in this show, including the best of show. This was made by a teacher. This was the back of the quilt with a rifle, and if you look on the right, you can see the outline of a human form. So you can go back and take a closer look at these quilts and these statements. It is a scourge in our country. The majority of Americans are fed up with it, and we just hope that we come up with some kind of solution soon. This was naming all of the students and teachers who died in Uvalde, Texas, at the Robb Elementary. And here's a quilt on the same topic that just says, enough. enough is enough. Let's see. Well, I always have more that I can show you in an hour, depending on how much I talk. As usual, I talk too much. I'm just going to page through these really quick. I want you to be aware of this Australian quilter who has an online group called Dreamlines. And this is some of the work that she and her students have been doing. So look up Brenda Gale Smith Dreamlines if you like this. I love this. I want to remind all of you about Sacred Threads. We'll be moving to Indianapolis in 2025, and the call for entry is this year and in April and another one later, but you can go to their website and find out more about it. This was the entrance to the show last year. Oh, look, that's my quilt on the right. This quilt has been to a couple places so far. It's been featured in Quilt Folk magazine, on the cover of Patchwork Professional magazine in Germany, and it's going to the DAR Museum, and next week I'll be at the opening at the DAR Museum. And if you follow me at Equilter, of course, I'll tell you more about this. Here's somebody else who I've been mentoring. He was at QuiltCon last year. He's been at a couple shows here in the US this year in California. And somebody to watch. Linda is another quilter who I just love watching as she creates things. She always shares on Facebook as she puts them together. This is her latest piece, which was a commission. And, let's just think about the things that are going on in the world around us that might be influencing our art. These are photos of a fire that happened here in Colorado in the last few years. These are quilts that are being made about, the seasons out of sorts, the climate, the drought. And of course, we have the continuing war. I thought this was just a really poignant image. We have, gosh, how many refugees are there now? Must be over 120 million. We have the Olympics coming up. There are going to be images coming out of the Olympics. This is from the Tokyo Olympics. Those moments where we all come together in peace with the flags of the world. Watch for that as an inspiration this year. And I can't tell you about all of this, but here is an astronaut who I have met through my work. Here's a little bit of my work in case you're not familiar. You can go to my artist website, luanarubin.com, if you'd like to learn more about my work. And so these are some of the shows I've been in recently. This is my most recent work about endangered pollinator here in Colorado. And this is a small piece that I just made that's going to the Sakwa Spotlight auction. This piece is 6 by 8 inches and it's going to be auctioned off to raise money for Sakwa. This is the show that butterfly was in. And just a couple resources to remind you, Sakwa Textile Talks are every Wednesday, and it is a fantastic resource for inspiration, and all of the talks are recorded and online. And also, Black Women Stitch, Lisa Woolfork is somebody who I've been following, and she's been organizing and supporting Black Stitchers in the US, and watch for her name. We're starting to carry this magazine, Patchwork Professional, from Germany because it's such a high quality, fantastic magazine, and I bet most of you have not heard of it. So take a quick screenshot or photo or go back to this in the recording. These are ongoing trends to watch. I'll just give you a few seconds here to take a screenshot or photograph or something of this. I hope that you will visit us at Equilter. We have an exclusive line of digital fabric. Sign up for our newsletters and take a screenshot or a photo of this too. You can find my photos, including all these quilt photos, at flickr.com/Luana Rubin. And well, I'm gonna stop there. I think you guys all know that we raise money for charity, including for Doctors Without Borders and breast cancer research. So every time you make a purchase from us, 2% goes to charity, and we've raised over 2 million US dollars so far.